Sometimes the loudest explosions don't come from breaking headlines or fiery speeches. Sometimes they come from a quiet sentence, a silent announcement, or a door that closes without warning. And when that silence comes from one of the largest automakers in North America, the shock isn't just economic. It cuts into the identity of a nation that has spent decades trying to protect its manufacturing heart. That's exactly what happened when General Motors made a move so abrupt, so cold, and so widely misunderstood that it didn't just disrupt a single plant. It set off a political chain reaction that shook boardrooms from Detroit to Washington. What looked like a routine corporate decision turned out to be the moment Canada finally snapped. The moment a country long accused of being too polite decided it was finished being pushed around. And the moment Ottawa revealed a weapon no company expected. A rules-based retaliation tool built in. Silence designed in secrecy and unleashed with pinpoint precision. Tonight on Northern Pulse, we break down how GM's quiet closure triggered one of the strongest economic counterattacks in modern Canadian history, and why this showdown is no longer just about cars, but about power, sovereignty, and the future of North America itself. The news didn't arrive with cameras, speeches, or managers gathering workers in a room. It came like a cold verdict dropped onto a community that had already endured more uncertainty than most. General Motors officially shut down production of its Bright Drop electric delivery van in Ingersoll, Ontario. No temporary pause. No, we'll be back soon. Just a quiet decision with devastating consequences. More than 1,200 families saw their futures collapse in a single moment. These weren't people drifting in and out of short-term contracts. Many had spent decades at the plant, long before electric vans ever entered GM's lexicon. They built engines, parts, components, then transitioned into the new EV dream Canada believed would anchor its economic future. They trusted GM workers took the company at its word when it promised long-term innovation, stability, and growth. Ottawa and Ontario believed it too, pouring billions into subsidies and infrastructure to support the EV revolution. And then one morning, everything disappeared. The community didn't see this as a business decision. It saw it as a broken agreement. A betrayal disguised as corporate restructuring. But the real shock was still ahead. Canada was no longer the Canada companies thought they could push around. 3 days later, the government spoke, but it didn't yell, it didn't rage, it didn't demand. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly and Finance Minister François Philippe-Champagne released a statement so controlled, so calm, that at first glance it looked harmless. It simply said GM and Stellantis had violated commitments made to Canadian workers and the federal government. But to anyone who knows trade law, to corporate executives who read policy language like stock tickers, that single sentence was a thunderclap, because that phrasing meant the government wasn't disappointed. It was activating something. Behind the scenes, Canada had been preparing for this exact moment. Years of plant closures, subsidy abuse, and broken promises had finally pushed Ottawa to build a weapon powerful enough to force corporations to honor their commitments, and GM had just triggered it. Across North American boardrooms, one question echoed. Did Canada really just pull the trigger? Yes. Yes, it did. And the consequences would be immediate. Months earlier, while corporations assumed Canada would keep playing the old game, give subsidies, accept losses, stay quiet, Ottawa built something entirely new. The auto remission framework, a legal, rules-based mechanism designed to punish companies that lied, delayed, or walked away from commitments to Canadian workers. And unlike past policies, this one wasn't negotiable. It was built to remove emotion from the equation. It was automatic. Under this framework, companies that honored their commitments retained duty-free access to Canada's auto market. Companies that broke their commitments, they would lose it instantly. GM became the first corporation to learn just how serious the consequences were. Their duty-free import quota was slashed by 25%. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a warning. It was a direct financial strike. Every GM vehicle imported from the U.S., crossovers, sedans, trucks, SUVs, now faced a crushing 25% tariff at the border. A $45,000 vehicle jumped to more than $56,000. No dealership could swallow that cost. No Canadian buyer would tolerate it. No executive could ignore it. GM expected a protest. Instead, it got a system, a cold, precise, permanent system. And Canada wasn't done. GM's penalty was severe. Stellantis' penalty was devastating. Canada cut half of Stellantis' tariff-free import allowance, a blow big enough to put their entire Canadian sales strategy at risk. For decades, companies used fear as leverage. Give us subsidies or we'll leave. Cut regulations or we'll close the plant. Give us incentives or we'll move production. But now something had changed. Canada, the country everyone thought would bend, had flipped the script. Corporations weren't threatening Canada anymore. Canada was threatening them. And unlike a political speech, the auto remission framework didn't expire, didn't depend on a government term, and didn't bend to negotiation. It followed rules, and the rules were ironclad. Executives who once assumed Canada would always give in suddenly saw a new reality. Ottawa wasn't begging. Ottawa was enforcing. GM had ignored Ottawa for months. Emails unanswered, meetings delayed, promises pushed into the future. But once the tariffs hit, GM executives panicked. Suddenly they wanted urgent meetings. Suddenly they wanted dialogue. Suddenly they were ready to listen. Melanie Joly sat them down and laid out rules that sounded more like a court order than a negotiation. GM had 15 days, not 15 days to think about it, not 15 days to propose options, not 15 days for another delay. Canada demanded exact production models, concrete schedules, integration into GM's long-term EV pipeline, a real plan for the Ingersoll plant. Failed to deliver, the tariffs would become permanent. The message echoed through every major automaker. If this is how Canada responds to one broken promise, what happens if we break ours? Ford immediately paused its internal planning. Stellantis reorganized its leadership team in Canada. Everyone felt the pressure, and workers felt something they hadn't felt in years. Government willing to fight for them. GM's collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. It landed in the middle of one of the most chaotic diplomatic moments Canada has faced in years. A moment when Donald Trump's trade war had already thrown the entire North American economy into uncertainty. What should have been a straightforward negotiation between Washington and Ottawa kept falling apart, not because of policy differences, but because of Trump's unpredictable responses. Talks between Carney and Trump were actually improving at one point. There was momentum, cautious optimism, maybe even a path toward a deal that both sides could live with. And then everything fell apart over a single advertisement. The Ontario government released an anti-tariff ad that openly criticized Trump's economic bullying. Within hours, Trump pulled the plug on negotiations again. No warning, no attempt to resolve it. Just another hard stop that pushed Canada back into crisis mode. This moment forced Ottawa to confront a reality it had been avoiding for years. The United States was no longer the stable partner Canada once depended on, and the public felt it too. Polls started showing something unprecedented. Canadians now viewed the U.S. as a bigger economic threat than China. That shift alone would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. But after months of escalating trade chaos, people saw how quickly Washington could turn an ally into a target. Businesses panicked. Premiers demanded clarity. And for the first time in decades, Ottawa realized it needed more than hope. It needed new options, new alliances, new leverage. And that tension between an unreliable United States and a rising China pushed Canada toward a diplomatic gamble no one expected. A gamble that would reshape alliances, unsettle Washington, and signal that Canada was no longer willing to be trapped between two powerful rivals. Everything was shifting, and GM had picked the worst possible moment to test Canada's patience. Canada's shift toward China didn't happen by accident. It happened because the ground under Ottawa was collapsing. With Trump's trade war spiraling and GM's crisis deepening, Canada found itself cornered between two global powers, both demanding loyalty while offering volatility. But instead of panicking, Prime Minister Mark Carney made a move that stunned diplomats across the world. He reached out to Beijing. For 8 long years, Canada and China had barely exchanged pleasantries, let alone cooperation. The Meng Wanzhou arrest, followed by the detentions of Michael Kovry and Michael Spavor, froze the relationship in a deep, bitter winter. Diplomats privately said healing that wound could take decades. And yet, on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea, Carney and Xi Jinping sat down for a 40-minute meeting that instantly rewrote the story. Smiles, Handshakes, warm statements, signs of a thaw no analyst expected. The readout from Ottawa framed it as a turning point, emphasizing shared goals, renewed dialogue, and upcoming plans for Carney to visit China. Beijing sensed Canada's vulnerability and moved quickly. China hinted that it was open to lifting its canola restrictions, a major pain point for Canadian farmers if Ottawa dropped its EV tariffs. It was the clearest sign yet that China saw opportunity where Washington offered hostility. Even Canadian political figures began adjusting their tone. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, once loudly critical of Beijing, suddenly advocated for a more stable relationship with China, and public opinion reflected the shifting mood. Canadians were growing more frustrated with U.S. unpredictability than with China's past disputes. Experts warned that this wasn't about choosing sides, it was about survival. When your biggest partner becomes unreliable, diversification stops being strategy and becomes necessity. Canada wasn't turning pro-China, it was turning pro-stability. And this single diplomatic move, Carney sitting down with Xi, sent a message Washington couldn't ignore. Canada was done waiting for the U.S. to act like an ally. Everything now comes down to a countdown, 15 days that could determine not just GM's future in Canada, but the future of North America's auto industry. What started as a quiet plant closure in Ingersoll has escalated into a make-or-break moment with consequences stretching far beyond one company. GM is being forced into a corner it never imagined, and Canada is standing its ground with a confidence the auto world hasn't seen before. GM must present a complete, actionable, verifiable production plan for the plant it abandoned. Canada isn't asking for vague promises or recycled corporate statements. Ottawa wants exact models, confirmed timelines, and proof that the facility will be folded into GM's long-term EV strategy. And the message is crystal clear. If GM fails to meet these conditions, the tariffs will remain. Not for months, not until negotiations resume, but permanently. Permanent tariffs of this size would be catastrophic. GM's US-built SUVs, trucks, and crossovers would become nearly unsellable in the Canadian market. Dealerships would face inventory chaos. Supply chains would be forced to reorganize. Investors would panic as GM's North American strategy fractured. And automakers across the continent are watching closely, wondering whether Canada's new rules could one day apply to them. But for Canadian workers, this moment is deeper than economics. It represents something they've waited years for. A government finally willing to defend the jobs that keep communities alive. For the first time in a generation, the fear of closures and broken promises has shifted away from workers and landed squarely on corporations. As the 15-day clock ticks, the question grows louder. Will GM return to Canada with respect or walk away and trigger a continental crisis? This final decision won't just shape one factory. It will shape the balance of power in North America for years to come.